You should be grateful I'm leaving you the house, Thomas said, sliding the notarized paperwork across our kitchen table. Retirement account, emptied. $487,000 gone for what he called his fresh start. He never bothered to ask about the weathered envelope I'd kept in my grandmother's antique desk, the inheritance document worth 20 times what he'd just stolen. The look on his face 3 months later when I purchased his struggling company through my family's trust fund was worth every moment of patience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I nodded, the same practiced expression of quiet resignation I'd perfected during our 15 years of marriage. The expression that had convinced him I was financially naive, despite my economics degree, and the financial legacy that had quietly followed my family for generations. I've earned this new chapter, he continued, checking his luxury watch, the one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. The retirement fund was mostly my contribution anyway. You barely worked while raising the kids. If only he knew that. The charity galas I organized each year were actually board meetings for my family's century-old investment trust. Or that my book club friends were financial advisors managing our portfolio that had quietly outperformed his company's stock 3-to-1 for the past decade. Before we continue this story of patience, hidden strength, and perfectly timed revelation, I want to thank you for joining our community of resilience. If you're finding value in these narratives of empowerment and strategic patience, please consider subscribing. It costs nothing and helps us continue sharing these important stories with those who need them most. Now, let's return to how this all began. My grandmother Isabella raised me with one fundamental principle. True power lies not in what others see, but in what they don't. As the sole heiress to a shipping empire built in the 1920s, she had watched too many fortune seekers circle her life like vultures. When I met Thomas at Georgetown University, I was already managing a modest portion of my family's assets, though no one would have guessed it from my apartment or wardrobe. I drove a used Honda, lived in a comfortable but unremarkable apartment, and worked part-time at a local nonprofit. Thomas, with his business degree and ambitious plans for a consulting firm, seemed refreshingly focused on building something rather than inheriting it. I'm going to create an empire, he'd promised during our early dates, his eyes bright with ambition. Something we can pass down to our children someday. I believed him. More importantly, I respected his desire to build something of his own. So when we married, I made a choice. I kept my inheritance separate, documented but dormant. I wanted us to succeed on our shared efforts, not my family's legacy. The first decade was everything we'd hoped for. Thomas launched his business consulting firm, Meridian Solutions, and I supported him while raising our children, James and Emma. When they entered school, I established a small financial advisory practice, modest in scope, but allowing me to maintain my skills while using only a fraction of my knowledge and connections. It's cute that you want to work too, Thomas would say, kissing my cheek as he left for important meetings. A little mad money for your shopping. What he saw as a hobby generated enough for our children's college funds, separate from the educational trusts my grandmother had already established for them. Trusts that Thomas knew nothing about, because true power lies not in what others see. The change began after Thomas secured several high-profile clients. Success transformed him, or perhaps revealed him. The ambitious partner became increasingly dismissive, first of my contributions to our household, then of me personally. "Rebecca," he declared one evening, returning from a business trip to London, "I've been thinking about our image. Meridian is attracting serious players now. Perhaps you should focus more on our social presence than that little advisory business." By our 14th anniversary, the pattern was clear. With each new client, each business magazine mention, Thomas grew more distant, more critical, more convinced of his singular brilliance. The consulting industry, he explained repeatedly, was about perception and confidence. And his perception was that a wife with a hobby job undermined his executive authority. What he never noticed, how often his brilliant insights for clients came from strategies I'd casually mentioned over breakfast. How many of his intuitive market predictions stemmed from reports I'd left open on our shared home computer. How his biggest client had actually been referred by one of my book club friends, the managing director of a major investment firm who recognized my husband's name when I mentioned him. Then came the text messages from his executive assistant, Vanessa, the late meetings, the sudden business trips, the new cologne. I didn't need the private investigator I briefly considered hiring. Thomas had grown careless, confident that I remained the same financially dependent wife he'd convinced himself I'd always been. I discovered the truth about our retirement account purely by accident. While searching for tax documents in Thomas's home office, I found a rental agreement for a luxury waterfront apartment, beginning the following month. That same evening, I logged into our shared investment platform to find our retirement account had been liquidated entirely. Every penny of our 15-year safety net, gone. When confronted, Thomas didn't even bother to lie convincingly. "It's complicated, Rebecca. I need a fresh start. Meridian is facing some temporary cash flow issues. Once I turn things around, I'll make it up to you and the kids." He spoke as if discussing a minor inconvenience, not the theft of our entire financial future. That night, after he'd gone to sleep, I sat in my grandmother's study, staring at the antique desk where I kept the documents detailing my true financial position, the inheritance I'd kept separate all these years out of respect for his desire to build something of his own. My grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the elegant fountain pen she'd given me on my 21st birthday. Patience reveals character. Pressure reveals truth. Thomas had revealed his truth. Now it was time to reveal mine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after discovering Thomas's betrayal, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The resignation I'd performed for so long had become a comfortable mask, but beneath it, my grandmother's lessons stirred to life. It was time to implement what she had taught me about patience, strategy, and the precise application of power. "I'm meeting with a divorce attorney today," Thomas announced over breakfast, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Just to get the paperwork started. The sooner we make this transition, the better for everyone." "Of course," I replied, pouring him coffee exactly the way he liked it. "Will you be home for dinner? I thought I might make your favorite, that salmon dish from our anniversary." He glanced up, momentarily confused by my calm. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't make this difficult, Rebecca. We both know this marriage hasn't been working for a long time." "I'm not making anything difficult," I said softly. "I just want this to be amicable." That word, amicable, seemed to reassure him. He nodded, returned to his phone, and finished his coffee before leaving without a goodbye kiss. The routine of 15 years broken so easily. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I went to my grandmother's desk and unlocked the hidden drawer with the key I wore around my neck. Inside was the document that would change everything. The inheritance trust papers that designated me as the primary beneficiary and sole controller of the Whitmore family holdings, valued at approximately $18 million in diversified assets. For 15 years, I had maintained the legal separation between these assets and our marital property, filing the proper disclosures with my private attorney, but never flaunting my inheritance. The annual distributions had been automatically reinvested, growing the principal substantially while I lived on my advisory business income and Thomas's generous allowance. I called Richard Donovan, my family's attorney for 3 generations. "It's time," I said simply when his secretary put me through. "Rebecca." His voice carried the warm formality I'd known since childhood. I've been wondering when you'd call. I saw the withdrawal from your joint account yesterday. Quite substantial. Of course he had. My grandmother had instructed him to monitor all financial movements connected to our family, however tangentially. Thomas is leaving. He's taken our retirement fund, $487,000, and claims Meridian Solutions is having cash flow problems. I see. Richard's tone shifted to something cooler, more professional. And how would you like to proceed? I need to understand Meridian's actual financial position, immediately and discreetly. Consider it done. Anything else? I paused, considering my next words carefully. I want to activate the Kingfisher Protocol. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. The Kingfisher Protocol was my grandmother's creation, a comprehensive strategy for protecting family assets when a relationship turned adversarial. It involved forensic accounting, strategic legal positioning, and, if necessary, the calculated acquisition of vulnerable business assets connected to the adverse party. Rebecca, Richard said finally, once initiated, Kingfisher cannot be easily stopped. Are you certain this is what Isabella would advise? I thought of my grandmother's portrait hanging in my study, her knowing eyes that seemed to see through all pretense. She would say I've been patient long enough. Very well, I'll contact our financial investigation team immediately. Expect preliminary reports within 48 hours. After hanging up, I called Sophia Chen, my closest friend from the book club and the managing director at Eastlake Capital. I need a favor, I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. What do you know about Meridian Solutions' current financial position? Sophia's laugh was dry. Funny you should ask. They've been shopping around for emergency capital for the past 3 months, overextended on that Denver expansion, and their London office is hemorrhaging money. Why? So Thomas had been lying about Meridian's success too. The cash flow issues weren't temporary, they were structural. Just curious. Thomas mentioned some concerns. Rebecca, Sophia's voice turned serious. As your friend, not your financial advisor. If Thomas has tied your personal finances to Meridian, you need to separate them. Yesterday. That's exactly what I'm doing, I replied. And Sophia? I may need to utilize my trust's full liquidity in the near future for an acquisition opportunity. The rest of the day passed in a blur of purposeful activity. I visited my private, safe deposit box to retrieve additional documentation. I contacted my personal banker to ensure my individual accounts were secured against any unauthorized access. I met with a divorce attorney recommended by Richard, not the most aggressive in town, but the most strategically minded. By the time Thomas returned home that evening, earlier than expected, his expression tense, I had initiated the first phase of the Kingfisher Protocol. Dinner smells good, he said cautiously, loosening his tie. I smiled, placing the perfectly prepared salmon on the dining table I'd set with our best china. How was your day? Complicated. Thomas poured himself a generous glass of the expensive Cabernet I'd opened. The attorney thinks we can handle this without much drama. I've drafted a settlement offer that's more than fair. I'm sure it is, I replied, serving him the roasted vegetables he preferred. Did your meetings at Meridian go well? A flash of something, worry, fear, crossed his face before he masked it. Fine. The usual challenges of growth. Growth, I echoed, taking a small sip of wine. That's good to hear. Your London office must be performing exceptionally then. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. London? Why would you ask about London specifically? I shrugged, the picture of casual interest. You mentioned expansion challenges last month. I assumed London, since you've been traveling there so frequently. Thomas studied me with newfound wariness, as if seeing something unexpected. Rebecca, I hope you're not going to make this difficult. The divorce, I mean, It's better for everyone if we handle this like adults. Like the adult who emptied our retirement account without discussion, or the adult who signed a lease on a waterfront apartment while pretending all was well in our marriage. He set down his fork. You've been snooping through my things. I was looking for tax documents, but yes, I found more than I expected. I maintained my calm, taking another bite of salmon. Delicious, don't you think? I added that ginger soy glaze you always enjoy. His face flushed with anger. This is exactly why our marriage failed. You're passive-aggressive, refusing to address problems directly, always playing the perfect wife while silently judging. I set down my own fork and looked directly into his eyes. Thomas, I've never been passive-aggressive. I've been patient. There's a difference. Patient? He scoffed. Is that what you call it? 15 years of quiet resentment? 15 years of watching you become someone I didn't marry, I corrected. And 15 years of protecting what's mine while you built what you claimed was ours. Something in my tone must have finally registered. Thomas's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. What exactly does that mean? I dabbed my lips with my napkin, set it beside my plate, and rose from the table. It means I've accepted your terms for divorce. I won't contest your departure or your relationship with Vanessa. Relief flooded his features. But, I continued, I will be conducting a complete forensic accounting of Meridian Solutions, given that you've classified our retirement fund as a business investment rather than marital property. The color drained from his face. You can't do that. You have no standing. Actually, I do. As of this morning, I'm a creditor to Meridian Solutions. I've purchased the outstanding debt from First Capital Bank. Thomas stood so quickly his chair tipped backward, crashing to the floor. That's impossible. First Capital wouldn't sell without board approval. You're right. Fortunately, I happen to know someone on their board. We're in the same book club. For the first time in our marriage, I watched Thomas struggle to form words. The confident, dismissive husband was gone, replaced by a man beginning to realize he'd made a critical miscalculation. This is just spite, he finally managed. You can't run a business investigation out of revenge. I walked calmly to my grandmother's desk, unlocked the drawer, and removed the Whitmore family trust documents. This isn't revenge, Thomas. It's correction. There's a difference. As I handed him the papers that detailed my true financial position, the inheritance he'd never known about, the trust that had quietly grown while he built his consulting firm, on borrowed capital and borrowed ideas, I felt no triumph, only a sad certainty that this moment had been inevitable from the day success had turned my husband into a stranger. Read them, I said softly, and then we can discuss what fair really looks like. The days following my revelation to Thomas unfolded like a chess match, where one player suddenly realizes they've been playing against a grandmaster. He cycled through predictable stages: disbelief, anger, desperate negotiation, and finally, a stunned recognition of his new reality. $18 million, he repeated for perhaps the 10th time, pacing our living room 2 evenings after I'd shown him the trust documents. All this time, why would you keep this secret? We could have what, Thomas? I asked, sitting calmly on the sofa. Used my inheritance to expand Meridian faster? Bought a bigger house? More expensive cars? Would that have made you respect me more or less? He stopped pacing, his expression shifting into something calculating. I recognized this look, his client acquisition face, the practiced charm he deployed when pursuing a valuable target. Rebecca, be reasonable. We've had our problems, but 15 years of marriage shouldn't end like this. We built a life together, had children together. He sat beside me, not quite touching. Maybe we've both made mistakes. Maybe we should reconsider this divorce. I almost laughed at the transparency of his pivot. $18 million had transformed me from dispensable wife to valuable asset overnight. Not because of who I was, but because of what I possessed. The divorce is proceeding, I said firmly. However, I'm willing to negotiate fair terms, including potentially restructuring Meridian's debt obligations to prevent bankruptcy. Thomas's facade cracked. Bankruptcy? That's ridiculous. We have temporary cash flow issues, nothing more. Is that why you emptied our retirement account? For temporary issues? Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Donovan. Kingfisher Phase 1 complete. Call when convenient. This was the catalyst moment, the point of no return. I stood, smoothing my skirt. I have a call to make. I suggest you spend this time contacting your attorney. You'll need better representation than you currently have. I left Thomas in the living room and retreated to my study, locking the door behind me. Richard answered on the first ring. The preliminary forensic accounting is complete, he said without preamble. It's worse than we thought. Meridian Solutions has been operating at a significant loss for nearly 2 years. Thomas has been falsifying financial reports to clients and banks alike. My hand tightened around the phone. Financial fraud? Substantial. He's been using new client retainers to pay obligations to existing clients, essentially a consulting industry Ponzi scheme. The London office doesn't actually have any active clients, despite Thomas's claims in their marketing materials. Closed my eyes, absorbing this information. Not just a betrayal of our marriage, but of professional ethics and possibly the law. What about our retirement funds? Can we trace where they went? Richard's sigh carried through the line. Partially to cover Meridian's immediate obligations. The rest appears to have been transferred to a recently opened account in the Cayman Islands. An exit strategy, I said, the pieces falling into place. He wasn't just leaving me. He was preparing to abandon the company once it collapsed. Precisely. We estimate Meridian has less than 60 days before complete financial collapse, unless drastic measures are taken. I thought of Meridian's employees, nearly 40 people who had no idea their jobs were balanced on a knife's edge. People with families, mortgages, children in college. Thomas's deception threatened more than just our marriage. What are our options under Kingfisher? Several, depending on your objectives, Richard replied. We could force Meridian into bankruptcy through our position as a major creditor. We could negotiate a structured buyout of Thomas's ownership stake at pennies on the dollar. Or we could execute a complete acquisition and reorganization. Each option represented a different kind of power. The power to destroy, the power to diminish, or the power to transform. My grandmother had taught me that the true measure of power wasn't in its exercise, but in its purpose. Prepare for acquisition, I decided. But first, I want to secure the retirement funds Thomas transferred offshore. Can we trace and freeze those accounts? With evidence of financial fraud? Yes. I'll contact our banking specialists immediately. After ending the call, I sat at my grandmother's desk, her portrait seeming to watch me with approval. The antique clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the moment I stepped fully into my power, not just as an heiress, but as a strategist in my own right. Thomas knocked on the study door. Rebecca, who were you talking to? I opened the door to find him, standing there, his expression a mixture of suspicion and calculation. I've been thinking, he said, his tone conciliatory. We should bring in a mediator, someone to help us navigate this situation fairly. I agree that fairness is important, I replied. That's why I've instructed my attorney to file emergency injunctions freezing all of Meridian's accounts as well as our personal offshore holdings. The blood drained from his face. Offshore holdings? I don't know what the Cayman account where you transferred $342,000 of our retirement funds? I interrupted calmly. That offshore account? Thomas took an involuntary step backward. You can't possibly know about that? I finished for him. Thomas, did you really think my family's wealth came without connections? Without resources? The moment you decided to empty our retirement account, you triggered monitoring systems that have been in place for years. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes, not just the fear of losing money or status, but the dawning realization that he was dramatically outmatched. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Initially, I wanted a marriage based on mutual respect and partnership. Then I wanted an honest divorce with equitable distribution of our marital assets. I stepped closer, my voice hardening. Now I want accountability, not just for me, but for Meridian's employees and clients who trusted you. "You'll destroy everything," he protested. "If this gets out," "If what gets out? That you committed financial fraud? That you were planning to abscond with stolen funds while leaving your employees without jobs and your clients without the services they paid for?" Thomas sank into the hallway chair, his head in his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The London expansion was going to turn everything around. We just needed more time, more capital. "More lies," I corrected. "The London office has no clients, Thomas. It never did." His head snapped up. "How could you possibly know that?" "The same way I know about the apartment you leased for Vanessa. The same way I know about the false reports you've been sending to First Capital Bank. The same way I know that Meridian has been insolvent for 20 months. Thomas's expression crumpled. The facade of the successful consultant completely collapsed. In that moment, I saw him clearly. Not as the confident man I'd married or the dismissive husband he'd become, but as someone who had built his entire identity on appearances and deception. "What happens now?" he asked, sounding suddenly much older. "Now," I said, returning to my study, "you contact your attorney and explain that you'll be cooperating fully with a financial fraud investigation. You'll surrender all passwords, account information, and company records to the forensic accountants arriving at Meridian tomorrow morning. And if I refuse?" And I gave him a level look. "Then my attorneys file criminal charges tomorrow instead of working toward a private restructuring agreement." As he left the house that night, presumably to the waterfront apartment he'd leased, I didn't feel the triumph I had imagined. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peaceful resolve. The path forward was clear, not because of the inheritance that had given me financial options, but because of the lessons that had come with it. My grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from her portrait. "Power isn't about domination, Rebecca. It's about restoration." The next morning, I implemented the next phase of the Kingfisher Protocol, the decisive action that would either restore Meridian Solutions or reveal it as beyond salvation. I had Richard organize an emergency meeting of Meridian's executive team, excluding Thomas, at their downtown offices. As I walked into the boardroom where 7 confused executives waited, I carried my grandmother's fountain pen and a leather portfolio containing the future of their company. They had never met me, except perhaps briefly at holiday parties. They certainly didn't recognize me as anyone with authority over their professional lives. "Good morning," I began, taking the seat at the head of the table. "My name is Rebecca Whitmore Harrison. As of 9 a.m. today, I am the majority creditor of Meridian Solutions. We have approximately 48 hours to determine whether this company can be saved." And with that declaration, I stepped fully into the power I had held in reserve for 15 years, not as Thomas's underestimated wife, but as my grandmother's true heir in both resources and resolve. The Meridian executives stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Elena Vasquez, the chief operating officer, was the first to find her voice. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harrison, what gives you the authority to call this meeting? Thomas is the CEO and majority shareholder." I opened my leather portfolio and slid copies of the debt acquisition documents across the polished mahogany table. As of yesterday, the Whitmore Trust has acquired all of Meridian's outstanding debt obligations from First Capital Bank, Westridge Financial, and 3 other creditors. Given the company's current financial position, these debts are now in technical default, which activates certain covenants. Marcus Chen, the chief financial officer, grabbed the documents with trembling hands. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. This is irregular," he stammered, looking up at me with new wariness. "How did you even know about these debt instruments? Some of these loans aren't public information." "The same way I know that Meridian Solutions has been functionally insolvent for over a year," I replied calmly. "The same way I know that client retainers have been misappropriated, financial statements falsified, and offshore accounts established to shield assets from creditors." The room fell completely silent. "Are you saying we're bankrupt?" asked Daniel Forrester, head of client relations. "That depends entirely on what happens in the next 48 hours, I said. "I've brought forensic accountants who are already accessing your financial systems. They'll provide a complete picture of Meridian's actual position, not the fiction that's been presented to you, your clients, and your banking partners." Elena pushed back her chair, standing abruptly. "I need to call Thomas." "Mr. Harrison is currently unavailable," Richard Donovan interjected smoothly from his position by the door. "He's meeting with his legal counsel regarding certain irregularities in his financial management of the company." "What kind of irregularities?" Marcus asked, his face pale. I met his gaze directly. "The kind that typically result in federal charges." The ripple effect through the room was palpable. Executives exchanging alarmed glances, one woman actually gasping aloud. These people weren't just Thomas's employees, they were his co-conspirators, willing or unwitting. "I don't understand," Elena said, sinking back into her chair. "Thomas assured us last quarter that we were on track for record profits. The London expansion was supposed to be—" "There are no clients in London," I interrupted gently. "The office exists, but it has no legitimate business activity." For the next hour, I outlined what the preliminary forensic accounting had revealed: a sophisticated shell game where new client retainers were used to service existing obligations, where projected revenues were reported as actual income, and where company assets were systematically diverted to shell companies controlled by Thomas. As I spoke, I watched their faces transform from disbelief to horror, to the dawning realization that their professional reputations and possibly their personal finances were now at risk. "Why are you telling us this?" Daniel finally asked. "Why not just force the company into bankruptcy and be done with it?" It was a fair question, and one that went to the heart of what I was trying to accomplish. "Because 42 people work for Meridian," I replied, "most of them innocent of any wrongdoing. Because the clients who trusted this firm deserve better than to have their projects abandoned midstream. And because despite my husband's actions, I believe there's still value in what Meridian was meant to be." Before anyone could respond, the boardroom door burst open. Thomas stood in the doorway, his normally impeccable appearance disheveled, his eyes wild with a combination of rage and panic. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Rebecca, you have no authority to—" "Actually, she does," Richard interrupted, handing Thomas a court order. "This was issued an hour ago by Judge Michaels. It temporarily transfers operational control of Meridian Solutions to the majority creditor, which is now the Whitmore Trust, represented by Mrs. Harrison." Thomas scanned the document, his hands shaking visibly. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "We can and we have," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Please take a seat. Thomas, we were just discussing the future of Meridian." "There is no we," he hissed. "This is my company. I built it from nothing." "Did you?" I asked, opening another folder and removing a stack of client proposals. "These are the Bradford account documents, the Miller restructuring proposal, and the Westridge efficiency analysis. 3 of Meridian's most successful client engagements." I turned to the executives. "Would anyone like to explain the similarity between these proposals and certain strategy documents I provided to Thomas over breakfast conversations in the past 5 years?" Elena's brow furrowed as she examined the papers. "These are almost identical to our proprietary methodologies. How did you—" "Because they are my methodologies," I replied. Ideas I developed during my previous career that I shared with my husband over morning coffee. Ideas he apparently brought to Meridian and claimed as his own innovations. Thomas's face flushed dark red. That's absurd. You were a part-time financial advisor. These are complex business transformation strategies. I leveled my gaze at him. Before I chose to support your career and raise our children, I was the youngest ever partner at Whitmore Consulting. My grandmother's firm, the firm that pioneered half the methodologies Meridian claims to have developed. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the quiet boardroom. Even Richard, who had known me since childhood, looked surprised at this disclosure. You never told me you were a partner at Whitmore, Thomas said accusingly. You never asked about my career before we met? I replied simply. You were too busy telling me about your ambitions. Marcus Chen looked back and forth between us, clearly assembling pieces of a puzzle. Whitmore Consulting, the Whitmore Trust, that. Whitmore family? I nodded. Yes. And now the Whitmore Trust is prepared to offer Meridian Solutions a restructuring opportunity that would preserve the company, protect client engagements, and potentially save most jobs. At what cost? Thomas demanded. Your immediate resignation and the surrender of your ownership stake, I said without hesitation. Complete financial transparency, a new management structure, and the return of misappropriated funds, including our retirement account. Thomas laughed bitterly. Or what? You'll destroy the company out of spite? No, Thomas. Unlike you, I don't destroy things out of spite or selfishness. I turned back to the executives. If Mr. Harrison refuses the restructuring offer, the Whitmore Trust will still honor all active client contracts, offer employment to Meridian staff who pass ethics screening, and ensure an orderly wind-down of the business. I could see the calculations happening behind each executive's eyes. Their futures, their reputations, their financial security, all suddenly dependent on Thomas's decision. Elena was the first to speak. Thomas, if what Mrs. Harrison is saying is true, if we've been operating on falsified financials, we need to accept this offer. It's the only way to avoid criminal charges, Marcus added, his expression grim. For all of us. Thomas looked around the table at the colleagues who were rapidly becoming adversaries. The empire he'd built on deception was crumbling before his eyes, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he had no ready manipulation to deploy. This is still my company, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Thomas, I said, rising from my seat. It's a company you managed, built with other people's ideas, funded with other people's money, and nearly destroyed with your arrogance and deception. I walked to the large windows overlooking the city, remembering how proud I'd been when Thomas first leased this prestigious office space, how genuinely I'd celebrated his early successes, how completely I'd believed in his potential. You have until 5 p.m. to decide, I continued, turning back to face the room. Accept the restructuring offer or face the consequences of your actions without the protection of the Whitmore Trust. Thomas's expression hardened into something ugly and desperate. You think you've won, don't you? The quiet, supportive wife finally getting her revenge. I shook my head slowly. This isn't about winning or revenge, Thomas. It's about consequences and responsibility. Concepts you should have considered before emptying our retirement account. As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, I addressed the executives one final time. My team will be available in Conference Room B to answer your questions. I encourage each of you to consider your positions carefully, both legally and ethically, before the 5 p.m. deadline. Richard held the door as I exited, but Thomas's voice stopped me at the threshold. You planned this all along, didn't you? He called after me. Married me knowing someday you'd take everything. I turned back, meeting his gaze with a clarity I wished I'd shown years earlier. No, Thomas. I married you believing we would build something meaningful together. You're the one who decided to take everything, including our retirement and our trust. The difference is, I had resources you never bothered to discover because you were too busy underestimating me. As the boardroom door closed behind us, Richard gave me a sidelong glance. That wasn't in the Kingfisher protocol, he murmured. What wasn't? Offering to save the company, protecting the employees and clients. Your grandmother's version was more decisive. I smiled, thinking of Isabella's portrait in my study. Grandmother taught me to be strategic, not vengeful. The goal was never to destroy what Thomas built. It was to restore what he damaged, including my sense of self. By 4:30 that afternoon, Thomas's attorney had contacted Richard with their decision. By 5 p.m., Thomas had signed the restructuring agreement, surrendering his ownership stake in Meridian Solutions and agreeing to full financial restitution. By 6 p.m., I stood alone in what had been Thomas's corner office, looking out at the skyline as twilight settled over the city. Not as his wife, not as his victim, but as the interim CEO of the company he had built and nearly destroyed, the company I would now rebuild. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Chen. Heard the news. Isabella would be proud. I smiled, feeling the weight of my grandmother's fountain pen in my pocket. Power isn't about domination, she had taught me. It's about restoration, and restoration was exactly what would come next. 3 weeks after the boardroom confrontation, I sat across from Judge Eleanor Michaels in her chambers, watching as she reviewed the final documents detailing Thomas's financial malfeasance. Richard Donovan sat beside me, while Thomas and his attorney, Martin Phillips, occupied the chairs opposite. The contrast between the two men was striking. Richard composed and confident, Martin increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting progressed. Let me be clear, Mr. Harrison, Judge Michaels said, looking up from the thick folder. The evidence of financial fraud is substantial. Were this matter to proceed through normal channels, you would be facing federal charges with potential prison time. Thomas stared at the floor, his once commanding presence diminished. The expensive suit he wore, likely one of his last, given his new financial reality, hung slightly loose on his frame. Stress had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth, aging him years in just weeks. However, the judge continued, given Mrs. Harrison's proposal and the district attorney's willingness to consider alternative resolution, I'm prepared to approve this settlement agreement. She turned her stern gaze to me. Mrs. Harrison, are you absolutely certain this is how you wish to proceed? You have every right to pursue criminal charges. I felt Thomas's eyes on me, sensing the first genuine fear I'd ever detected from him. Not fear of losing status or money, but the primal fear of losing freedom. I'm certain, Your Honor, I replied calmly. My objective is to salvage the company, protect innocent employees, and ensure proper restitution. Criminal proceedings would complicate all three goals. Judge Michaels nodded thoughtfully. Very well. Mr. Harrison, under the terms of this agreement, you will surrender all ownership interest in Meridian Solutions, which will be restructured under Mrs. Harrison's direction. You will make full restitution of the misappropriated retirement funds plus interest. You will comply with a 5-year prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any financial institution or publicly traded company. She leaned forward slightly. In exchange, Mrs. Harrison will not pursue criminal charges, provided you fully cooperate with the ongoing forensic accounting and make all required restitution payments. Do you understand these terms? Thomas cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Then sign these documents, she directed, pushing the stack toward him. As Thomas scrawled his signature on page after page, I studied the man I had married 15 years ago. The ambitious, charming business school graduate who had promised to build something meaningful. Had that person been real, or merely a performance designed to impress and acquire? Had success changed him, or merely revealed his true nature? After the signing, as we exited the judge's chambers, Thomas lingered in the courthouse hallway. Richard tactfully stepped away, giving us a moment of privacy. "Is this what you wanted all along?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "To see me humiliated? To take everything I built?" "No, Thomas," I said quietly. "What I wanted was a true partnership. What I wanted was honesty. What I wanted was for you to actually be the man you pretended to be." His laugh was bitter. "And now you get to play the righteous victim while destroying my life." "Your choices destroyed your life," I corrected gently. "I'm merely ensuring those choices don't destroy 40 other lives in the process." "So noble," he sneered. "The secret? Heiress stepping in to save everyone from the villainous husband. Will that be the story you tell our children?" The mention of James and Emma, now away at college and largely insulated from the worst details of our separation, struck a painful chord. "I'll tell our children the truth," I replied. "That their father built something valuable but made serious mistakes. That people, even parents, sometimes fail to live up to their own potential. And that when faced with those failures, we have choices about how to respond." Thomas studied me, searching for the anger or vindictiveness he clearly expected to find. Finding none, his posture changed subtly, some of the defensive hostility draining away. "The London office wasn't entirely fabricated," he said suddenly. "We had 3 potential clients, serious prospects. If they had signed, then you'd have had 3 new retainers to misappropriate," I finished for him. "The pattern wouldn't have changed, Thomas. The fundamental problem wasn't cash flow, it was integrity." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "You have no idea what it's like trying to compete in this industry. The pressure, the expectations." "Actually, I do," I interrupted. "Whitmore Consulting faced the same pressures, the same competitive landscape. The difference was in how we responded to those pressures." Thomas fell silent, perhaps truly hearing me for the first time since our confrontation had begun. After a moment, he asked, "What happens now?" "Now you begin again," I said simply. "With less than you had, but more than you deserve, given the choices you made. The rest is up to you." As Thomas walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt no triumph, only a weighted sadness for what might have been and a quiet resolve for what must come next. Richard rejoined me as we walked toward the courthouse. Exit. "That went as well as could be expected," he observed, "though I still think you're being too lenient." "It's not leniency, Richard. It's strategy. Pressing criminal charges would have destroyed any chance of salvaging Meridian, and it wouldn't have recovered our retirement funds any faster. Your grandmother would have pursued scorched earth," he noted with a small smile. "Perhaps. But she also taught me that true power comes from making choices others can't imagine, including the choice for measured response when everyone expects retribution." As we stepped into the bright autumn sunlight, my phone buzzed with a text from Elena Vasquez. "Emergency at Meridian. Bradford threatening to pull contract. Need you here ASAP." The consequence chain was accelerating. Thomas's actions had set in motion ripple effects that would continue for months, perhaps years. Each revelation of his financial manipulations threatened another client relationship, another partnership, another employee's sense of security. I arrived at Meridian's offices 30 minutes later to find Elena pacing the reception area, her normally composed demeanor visibly strained. "Bradford's CEO is in conference room A," she reported immediately. "Their auditors flagged our last invoice as potentially fraudulent based on the hours reported versus deliverables." "Was it?" I asked directly. Elena hesitated. "Thomas personally approved those invoices. I didn't review them as thoroughly as I should have." This was the painful reality of the rebuilding process, discovering how many corners had been cut, how many ethical lines had been crossed, often involving people who should have known better but had deferred to Thomas's authority. "Is Marcus here?" I asked, referring to the CFO who was cooperating with our financial investigation. In his office, reviewing the Bradford account records. Have him bring everything to conference room A in 15 minutes. Complete transparency is our only option now. As I entered the conference room, Calvin Bradford, the silver-haired CEO of Bradford Manufacturing, rose from his seat, his expression severe. "Mrs. Harrison," he acknowledged coolly. "I was expecting Thomas." "Mr. Bradford, Thomas is no longer with Meridian Solutions," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Rebecca Whitmore Harrison, acting CEO during our restructuring process." Bradford's eyebrows rose. "Whitmore? As in Whitmore Consulting?" "Yes," I confirmed. "My grandmother's firm." He sat back, reassessing the situation. Isabella Whitmore was a legend in this industry. I worked with her firm in the 90s. Best strategic advice we ever received. "Thank you." She valued integrity above all else. In business relationships, a principle I'm now reinstating at Meridian. Bradford's expression remained skeptical. "Admirable, but it doesn't explain why my auditors found discrepancies in your billing that suggest we've been overcharged approximately $142,000 over the past 8 months. You haven't been overcharged, Mr. Bradford," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. "You've been defrauded, and I'm here to make it right." Over the next hour, with Marcus providing the detailed financial records, I walked Bradford through exactly what had happened, how Thomas had artificially inflated hours, charged for consultants who never worked on the project, and diverted portions of their payments to cover shortfalls elsewhere. Rather than attempting to minimize or justify these actions, I acknowledged them fully, presented documentation of the actual work performed versus what was billed, and offered 2 options: a complete refund of the overcharges or equivalent additional consulting hours at no cost. Throughout this painful disclosure, Bradford's expression shifted from anger to astonishment to something approaching respect. "Mrs. Harrison," he said finally, "in 40 years of business, I've never had a vendor voluntarily disclose that they've been cheating me." "This isn't about volunteering," I corrected. "It's about necessity and integrity. Meridian, or whatever, we become after restructuring, can only survive if we're radically transparent about past wrongs and absolutely committed to ethical practice going forward." Bradford studied me for a long moment. "Isabella taught you well," he said finally. "We'll take the additional consulting hours, and pending review of your restructuring plan, we'll consider renewing our contract when it expires next quarter." After he left, Elena exhaled shakily. "That was remarkable. He was ready to terminate immediately this morning. How many more clients will we need to have this conversation with?" "All of them," I said firmly. "Every single one where Thomas or his inner circle manipulated billing, exaggerated results, or otherwise misrepresented our work." Her eyes widened. "Rebecca, that could be catastrophic. If they all react badly, we'll have failed honestly rather than succeeded dishonestly," I interrupted. "The only way forward is through the truth, Elena. All of it, however painful." As the days turned into weeks, we had 16 more versions of the Bradford conversation. 9 clients stayed, impressed by our integrity and commitment to making things right. 7 left, unwilling to trust a firm that had deceived them, regardless of new leadership. The consequence chain rippled through every aspect of the business: staffing, finances, reputation, client relationships. Each day brought new challenges. As we untangled the complex web of deception Thomas had woven throughout Meridian's operations. Through it all, I maintained the steady, measured approach my grandmother had taught me. Not the scorched earth Richard had referenced, but a focused refinement, burning away what was corrupt while preserving what was valuable. By the end of the first month, we had stabilized enough to begin planning the formal restructuring. Seated in the same boardroom where I had confronted Thomas, I now faced the remaining executives with a simple question: What should this company become? The answers would shape not just Meridian's future, but my own path forward, one I was now free to choose without Thomas's shadow or limitations. The consequences of his betrayal had created an unexpected opportunity, the chance to build something entirely new from the ashes of what he had destroyed. 2 months after taking control of Meridian Solutions, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, facing an audience of industry colleagues, remaining clients, and financial press. The quarterly Business Leadership Forum had become an unexpected stage for our company's public reemergence after weeks of speculation and rumor within the consulting community. Thank you for that introduction, I began, adjusting the microphone slightly. As most of you know, Meridian Solutions has undergone significant changes recently. Today, I'd like to address those changes directly and share our path forward. From the third row, Richard Donovan gave me an encouraging nod. Beside him sat Sophia Chen and 3 other members of my book club, high-powered women from the financial sector who had rallied around me during the restructuring process. My support system had expanded beyond my grandmother's legacy to include allies I'd cultivated through my own quiet networking over the years. Meridian Solutions was founded on principles of strategic excellence and client partnership, I continued. Those principles were compromised through financial mismanagement and ethical failures at the highest levels of leadership. Rather than minimizing those failures or attempting to obscure them, we have chosen radical transparency and accountability. A murmur rippled through the audience. Corporate mea culpas were rare enough. Ones delivered with such forthright acknowledgement of wrongdoing were practically unheard of. Effective immediately, Meridian Solutions will complete its restructuring and relaunch as Whitmore Advisory Partners, I announced as the new logo appeared on the screen behind me. This isn't merely a rebranding. It represents a fundamental recommitment to the values established by my grandmother, Isabella Whitmore, when she founded Whitmore Consulting 4 decades ago. I saw recognition dawn on several faces, connections being made between the mysterious wife who had taken over her husband's failing company and the legendary family name in strategic consulting. For those unfamiliar with Isabella Whitmore's approach, it rested on 3 core principles: integrity in all client interactions, evidence-based strategy development, and implementation support that delivers measurable results. These principles will guide Whitmore Advisory Partners going forward, without exception or compromise. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined our restructuring process, our commitment to making restitution to any client who had been improperly billed, and our new leadership team, including Elena Vasquez as Chief Operating Officer and Marcus Chen as Chief Financial Officer, both of whom had proven their integrity during the investigation process. In closing, I said, approaching the end of my presentation, I want to address the question many of you have been too polite to ask directly. How did Meridian's financial improprieties go undetected for so long? And why am I, Thomas Harrison's wife, now leading the restructured company? The room grew noticeably quieter, the audience leaning forward almost as one. The simple answer is that I trusted a partner who betrayed that trust, professionally and personally. The more complex answer is that I allowed myself to be underestimated, to be seen as merely a supportive spouse rather than a knowledgeable business partner. Both were mistakes I won't repeat. I paused, making eye contact with several audience members before continuing. I was a partner at Whitmore Consulting before stepping back to raise my family and support my husband's career. That choice was mine, and I don't regret it. What I regret is forgetting my grandmother's most important lesson: that true power requires vigilance, not just capability. I've reclaimed that vigilance, and with it, the responsibility to rebuild what was damaged through my inattention. The Q&A session that followed was intense but respectful. Industry peers who had known Thomas for years struggled to reconcile the charismatic consultant they'd admired with the financial manipulator revealed by our investigation. Clients expressed cautious optimism about the restructured firm. Financial. Reporters probed for additional details about the scope of the fraud and the terms of our settlement with Thomas. Through it all, I maintained the balance my grandmother had taught me: transparent without being vindictive, accountable without being defensive, forward-looking without ignoring past failings. By the time I stepped away from the podium, the narrative had shifted noticeably from scandal to resurrection. Calvin Bradford approached as I gathered my materials. "Impressive presentation," he said, extending his hand. Isabella would have been proud. "Thank you," I replied, touched by his reference to my grandmother. "We're grateful for Bradford Manufacturing's continued partnership during this transition." "Partnership is built on trust," he said. "You've earned it back the hard way, by telling uncomfortable truths when most would have tried to minimize them." As Bradford moved away, I noticed a familiar figure hovering at the edge of the crowd: Vanessa Collins, Thomas's former executive assistant and apparent romantic interest. She approached hesitantly, her confidence clearly diminished since I'd last seen her at a Meridian holiday party. "Mrs. Harrison," she began, her voice barely audible above the crowd. I should apologize." I studied her, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the nervous way she clutched her purse. "For the affair with my husband, or for facilitating his financial fraud?" I asked quietly. She flinched. "Both, I suppose. But I didn't know about the fraud. Not the extent of it, anyway. Thomas said the company was just facing temporary cash flow issues." "And you believed him because it was convenient to believe him," I observed without malice. "Just as it was convenient to believe his marriage was already over when it wasn't." Tears welled in her eyes. "I've lost my job, my reputation, and my savings. Thomas convinced me to invest in one of his side ventures. All gone now." Another casualty in the consequence chain, I thought. Thomas had left destruction in his wake far beyond our marriage and Meridian's balance sheet. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "No one in the industry will hire me after this." I reached into my portfolio and retrieved a business card. "Sophia Chen at Eastlake Capital is hosting a financial literacy workshop for women next Thursday. It's designed for those rebuilding after financial setbacks." Vanessa stared at the card in confusion. "Why would you help me?" "I'm not doing it for you," I replied honestly. "I'm doing it because enabling others to rebuild is part of my own restoration process. What you do with the opportunity is entirely your choice." As she walked away, card clutched tightly in her hand, Richard appeared at my side. "That was unexpected," he observed. "Isabella might have chosen a more definitive response to the woman who had an affair with your husband." Smiled slightly. "Grandmother would have understood the difference between primary and secondary targets. Thomas was the architect of the deception. Vanessa was just another victim of his manipulation, albeit a willing one." The crowd was beginning to disperse. Business cards exchanged, new connections formed. Several attendees lingered, clearly hoping for a moment of my time. The public phase of our resurrection was proceeding better than I had dared hope. Elena approached with a tablet in hand. "Rebecca, we've received 3 new client inquiries since your presentation ended. Apparently, radical honesty is an attractive quality in a consulting firm." "Imagine that," I replied dryly. As we prepared to leave, my phone vibrated with an incoming text. "James, our son. Just saw the Business Journal article about you and Dad. Can we talk tonight?" My heart constricted. Despite our efforts to shield them, our children were inevitably being drawn into the vortex of consequences created by Thomas's actions and my response. James was a junior at Princeton, Emma a freshman at Northwestern. Both had been told a simplified version of our separation: irreconcilable differences, career paths diverging. The public nature of Meridian's restructuring and my emergence as CEO had made that simplified narrative untenable. Family meeting tonight, I texted back. Video. Call at 8. Love you. Richard noticed my expression change. The children? I nodded. They deserve the truth, but finding the right balance, enough honesty without unnecessary pain, that's proving more challenging than the corporate restructuring. They're adults, Rebecca, he reminded me gently, capable of understanding complexity. Understanding. Complexity and processing betrayal are different skills, I replied. One they shouldn't have to develop because of their father's choices. The conversation with James and Emma that evening was among the most difficult I'd ever navigated. Seated in my study, my grandmother's portrait seeming to watch over the video call, I answered their questions as truthfully as possible while avoiding unnecessary details that would only hurt them. So, Dad really stole our retirement money? Emma asked, her young face struggling to process this revelation. And he was cheating on you? Your father made a series of poor choices under financial pressure, I replied carefully. He convinced himself they were temporary measures, but they became a pattern. Why didn't you tell us the truth from the beginning? James demanded, his expression a painful mirror of Thomas's determined intensity. We're not children anymore. You're right, I acknowledged. I was trying to protect you both while I determined the best path forward. Perhaps that was my mistake, another form of underestimation. And now you're running Dad's company? Emma asked, confusion evident in her voice. I'm leading the restructured company, yes. It's actually a return to the work I did before you were born, at your great-grandmother's firm. Wait, James interrupted. Great-grandmother Isabella? The one with the trust funds for our education? She had a company? I realized then how completely I had compartmentalized my life, keeping my family history, my professional background, and my financial resources separate from my identity as Thomas's wife and James and Emma's mother. In trying to create space for Thomas's ambitions, I had hidden essential parts of myself from my own children. Yes, I said, feeling a weight lift as I finally integrated these separate aspects of my life. Whitmore Consulting was one of the pioneers in strategic advisory services. I was a partner there before I stepped back to raise you both. Why would you give that up? Emma asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the hurt in her expression. Because I wanted to be present for you and support your father's dreams. It was a choice I made freely, and one I don't regret. What I regret is losing touch with that part of myself completely. We talked for over 2 hours, about Thomas's fraud, about my hidden inheritance, about the company restructuring, and most importantly, about how these changes would affect our family going forward. By the end, though many questions remained, a new foundation of honesty had been established. Can we come home this weekend? James asked as the call was winding down. I want to understand more about great-grandmother's company, about your work. Before us. I'd like that, I replied, emotion tightening my throat. There's a legacy there that belongs to both of you too, whenever you're ready to explore it. After ending the call, I sat in the quiet of my study, gazing at Isabella's portrait. The public resolution of Meridian's transformation was proceeding, smoothly, but this private resolution with my children, that was the true measure of healing beginning to take place. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Bradford signed the 3-year renewal. Word is spreading about your presentation today. Whitmore Advisory Partners is officially on the map. I smiled, recognizing that the professional resurrection was inextricably linked to my personal one. As I had told the audience earlier, both involved reclaiming parts of myself that had been set aside, forgotten, or undervalued, not just by Thomas, but by my own choices and compromises. The consequences of Thomas's betrayal had forced me to step fully into my power, not just as an heiress or a wronged wife, but as a business leader in my own right. The public now knew exactly who Rebecca Whitmore Harrison was, and more importantly, so did I. 1 year after Thomas emptied our retirement account, I stood in the newly renovated headquarters of Whitmore Advisory Partners, watching as staff gathered for our annual meeting. The space bore little resemblance to Meridian's former offices. Gone were the imposing mahogany paneling and closed-door executive suites that Thomas had favored. In their place, a collaborative environment balanced private work areas with transparent meeting spaces, reflecting our commitment to both discretion and openness. Elena approached, tablet in hand as always. "Everyone's here? Ready when you are." I nodded, taking a moment to center myself before addressing the team of 45, a mix of original Meridian employees who had proven their integrity during the restructuring and new talent recruited specifically for their alignment with our values. "Thank you all for being here," I began as conversation quieted. 1 year ago today, Whitmore Advisory Partners officially launched. Many predicted we wouldn't survive 6 months. Some suggested the scandal surrounding our transformation would make client acquisition impossible. Others believed that reinventing a consulting practice while simultaneously addressing the fallout from financial improprieties was simply too ambitious. I paused, looking around at the faces before me. Some who had weathered the crisis alongside me, others who had joined us because they believed in our new vision. Those predictions were understandable, but they failed to account for one critical factor: the power of integrating truth with expertise. We didn't just survive this year, we thrived because we refused to separate ethics from excellence. The financial results displayed on the screen behind me confirmed this assessment. While smaller than Meridian's peak size, Whitmore Advisory Partners had achieved profitability in month 8, retained or regained relationships with 12 key clients, and established a reputation for both strategic insight and uncompromising integrity. Today, I'm pleased to announce 2 significant developments, I continued. First, effective immediately, Elena Vasquez will be promoted to Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Advisory Partners. Surprised murmurs rippled through the room, even as Elena's eyes widened in genuine shock. We had discussed her increasingly central role in operations, but I had kept the formal promotion confidential until this moment. Elena's leadership during our restructuring demonstrated exactly the qualities this firm needs moving forward: strategic clarity, ethical courage, and unwavering commitment to client success. As CEO, she will guide our continued growth while I transition to chairwoman, focusing on long-term strategy and key client relationships. The spontaneous applause that followed spoke volumes about Elena's standing among the team. As she moved to join me at the front, visibly moved by this vote of confidence, I could see the perfect balance of surprise and readiness in her expression. This was how leadership transition should work, recognizing excellence and creating space for new perspectives while maintaining institutional wisdom. The second announcement, I continued once the applause had subsided, involves the expansion of our philanthropic initiatives. Today, we're launching the Whitmore Foundation for Financial Education, with an initial endowment of $5 million from my family's trust. On the screen, the foundation's mission statement appeared: empowering individuals through financial literacy, ethical business education, and recovery support for victims of financial abuse. This foundation represents the completion of a full circle, transforming personal and professional challenges into community benefit. Maya Anderson, formerly of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, will serve as executive director, with programs launching in the first quarter of next year. The remainder of the meeting covered operational updates, recognition of key achievements, and our strategic focus for the coming year. Throughout, I watched Elena seamlessly step into her new role, fielding questions with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through demonstrated excellence rather than title or connection. Later, as staff dispersed to a celebratory lunch, Elena joined me in what was now her office, still processing the morning's announcement. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" she asked, a mixture of gratitude and mild accusation in her tone. I smiled. "Not from the beginning. But over the past 6 months, it became increasingly clear that your vision for Whitmore Advisory's future aligned perfectly with what the firm needs. My skills were essential for the resurrection phase, but sustainable growth requires different leadership. You're not actually stepping back, though, she observed shrewdly. The chairwoman role, the foundation, you're expanding your influence just in different directions. I'm integrating the parts of my life that were previously compartmentalized. I corrected. The business leader, the family wealth steward, the mentor, the community contributor. They're all aspects of the same whole. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Have you told Thomas about this transition? The question caught me off guard. Thomas had become an increasingly distant figure over the past year. Our divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, with surprisingly little conflict once he recognized the strength of my legal position and the extent of the evidence against him. Occasional updates from mutual connections revealed he had moved to Philadelphia, taken a mid-level position with a regional bank, and maintained sporadic contact with our children. No, I replied. Our communication is limited to necessary matters. Regarding James and Emma, this doesn't qualify. You're not even a little tempted to make sure he knows how successfully you've rebuilt what he nearly destroyed? I considered her question carefully. Early in this process, I might have been. There's a natural human desire for vindication, to ensure the person who hurt you recognizes the extent of their miscalculation. But that desire fades when you realize it's just another form of giving them power over your choices. My phone chimed with a calendar alert, a reminder of my afternoon appointment with James, who had transferred to Wharton for his senior year, partly to be closer to Philadelphia and his father, but also to take advantage of an internship opportunity at Whitmore Advisory. The complex family dynamics continued to evolve, with both children maintaining relationships with Thomas while establishing new connections to the Whitmore legacy I had finally shared with them. I should get going, I said, gathering my belongings. James is presenting his analysis of the Eastbrook acquisition today. Elena walked me to the door, then paused. Rebecca, for what it's worth, what you've built here goes beyond business, success. You've created a model for how to respond to betrayal with purpose rather than bitterness. That's a legacy Isabella would have valued even more than the financial resurrection. Her words stayed with me as I navigated the busy downtown streets to the university campus. The past year had been a continuous process of rebuilding, not just the company, but my sense of self, my relationship with my children, and my understanding of power and vulnerability. Each step had required conscious choices about what to preserve, what to discard, and what to transform. James was waiting outside the business school building, his expression brightening when he spotted me. At 21, he had grown into a thoughtful young man with Thomas's analytical mind, but, thankfully, a stronger ethical compass. Perfect timing, he said, greeting me with a quick hug. Professor Rankin just gave me his feedback on the presentation. He thinks the methodology is solid. I'm looking forward to seeing it, I replied as we walked toward the conference room where James would present his work to the Whitmore advisory team later that afternoon. How are things otherwise? Your classes going well? Really good. Oh, and I had dinner with Dad last night. James glanced at me, gauging my reaction to this casual mention of Thomas. How is he? I asked, having learned that neutral engagement was healthier than avoidance where the children's relationship with their father was concerned. Better, I think. More humble? He asked about the internship, actually seemed interested in what I'm learning rather than just telling me what I should be doing. That's good to hear, I said sincerely. Thomas's journey over the past year had been his own to navigate. If he was finding his way to a more authentic relationship with our children, I could only be grateful. He mentioned something else, James continued, his tone carefully casual. He's teaching a night class on business ethics at the community college. Ironic, right? I stopped walking, genuinely surprised by this information. Business ethics? James nodded. Part of his settlement with the regulatory authorities, I think. community service requirements, but he said it's actually been meaningful, making him think about where he went wrong. We resumed walking, but my mind was processing this unexpected development. Thomas, teaching ethics? The man who had systematically deceived clients, employees, and family, now guiding others on ethical business practices? It seemed inconceivable. And yet, wasn't that precisely the kind of transformation that represented true accountability? Not just legal consequences or financial penalties, but genuine recognition of one's failings and attempts, however imperfect, to make amends? Did he say anything else? I asked. James hesitated. He asked if you would be willing to meet with him, not about the divorce or money or anything like that. He said he has something he wants to tell you in person. My immediate instinct was to refuse. Thomas had manipulated me for years. Any request for a meeting could easily be another attempt at emotional leverage. And yet, the context gave me pause. If he was genuinely engaged in reflection, perhaps there was value in closure beyond the legal documentation of our separation. I'll think about it, I promised James. Now, tell me more about this presentation. I want to hear how you approached the valuation challenges. For the next hour, I immersed myself in James's project, impressed by his developing analytical skills and the thoughtful way he approached complex business problems. As we finalized his presentation materials, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically our relationship had evolved over the past year, from the protected child who knew little of my professional background to a young colleague engaging with the family business legacy. That evening, after James's successful presentation to the Whitmore advisory team, I returned to the house Thomas and I had shared for 15 years. Though I had considered selling it after the divorce, something had held me back. Perhaps it was reluctance to disrupt the children's sense of home further. Or perhaps it was recognition that the house itself wasn't tainted by what had happened within its walls. I settled in my study, once my grandmother's, now truly mine, and considered James's message about Thomas's request to meet. The rational part of me remained wary, cataloging all the ways Thomas had manipulated situations to his advantage in the past. But another part, perhaps the part that had once seen potential in the ambitious business school graduate, was curious about what genuine recognition of wrongdoing might look like. After careful consideration, I sent a brief text message. James mentioned you'd like to meet. I can spare 30 minutes at the Riverside Cafe next Thursday at 3 p.m. The response came almost immediately. Thank you. I'll be there. As I set down my phone, my eyes fell on my grandmother's portrait on the wall. Her expression, forever captured, in oils, seemed to hold both wisdom and caution, a reminder that true power lay in making conscious choices rather than reactive ones. What Thomas had to say mattered less than my own willingness to hear it from a place of strength rather than vulnerability. The retirement account he had emptied, the trust he had broken, the company he had nearly destroyed, all had been rebuilt into something stronger and more authentic than before. Whatever closure this meeting might provide would be on my terms, not his. I turned to the windows overlooking the garden, watching as evening shadows lengthened across the lawn. The new reality I had created wasn't defined by Thomas's betrayal, but by my response to it. A response that had integrated all the parts of myself I had once kept separate. In that integration lay a power no one could empty from any account. The Riverside Cafe occupied a quiet corner overlooking the park where Thomas and I had once spent Sunday afternoons during our early years together. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table with a clear view of both the entrance and the river beyond, and ordered a pot of Earl Grey, an intentional choice rather than the cappuccino Thomas would have expected me to order. Small acts of self-definition had become important to me over the past year. Reminders that I was no longer playing a role in someone else's narrative, but authoring my own. Thomas arrived precisely at 3, punctuality being one of his few consistently reliable traits. He paused at the cafe entrance, scanning the room until our eyes met. Even from a distance, I could see the changes a year had wrought. The designer suits replaced by more modest attire, the confident stride now more measured, the arrogant set of his shoulders softened by what appeared to be genuine humility. "Rebecca," he said as he approached, his voice carrying a formality that acknowledged the distance between us. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." I gestured to the chair across from me. "James mentioned you wanted to talk." Thomas sat, declining. The server's offer of a menu with a polite, "Just water, please." Once we were alone, he placed a manila envelope on the table between us. "First, I want to say that I'll understand if you don't believe anything I tell you today," he began. "I've given you every reason to doubt my sincerity over the years. It was an unexpected opening, an acknowledgement of his untrustworthiness rather than an attempt to establish credibility." "Why did you want to meet, Thomas?" I asked directly. He tapped the envelope. "Two reasons. First, to give you this. It's the final portion of the retirement account I took, with interest. The full restitution I promised." I made no move to take the envelope. "You could have sent this through our attorneys." "Yes," he agreed. "But then I wouldn't have had the opportunity to tell you directly that I'm sorry. Not just for taking the money, but for everything that led to that moment. The lies, the dismissal of your contributions, the affair with Vanessa, the belief that I was entitled to more than I had earned." His words were right, but I had heard perfectly crafted apologies from Thomas before, usually preceding requests or manipulations. I remained silent, waiting. "The ethics class I'm teaching," he continued after a moment. "It wasn't entirely court-mandated. I requested that specific form of community service. I thought it would be easy, a chance to present myself as an expert despite what happened at Meridian." Meridian, a wry smile crossed his face. "It's been the opposite of easy. Every case study, every principle I present, forces me to confront where I went wrong. My students ask questions I can't answer without examining my own failures. It's been educational in ways I never expected." For the first time, I could hear authenticity in his voice, the humility of someone genuinely confronting their mistakes rather than minimizing them. "I'm glad the experience has been valuable," I said carefully. Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Rebecca. What I did to you, to our family, to the people who trusted me at Meridian, it's not something that can be undone with an apology or a check. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I lost, and that it was entirely of my own making." The second reason for our meeting, when it came, surprised me completely. "James mentioned that Emma is interested in pursuing psychology," Thomas said. "That she's specifically interested in financial psychology, how people make decisions about money and the emotional patterns that drive those decisions." I nodded, curious about this unexpected turn in the conversation. "I've established a scholarship at the university," Thomas explained, anonymous, for students studying that specific intersection of finance and psychology. Not with my name on it. That would be another form of ego. But I thought you should know, in case Emma ever applies for it. It would be appropriate if she benefited from it." "A scholarship?" I echoed, genuinely taken aback. Thomas's financial resources were now extremely limited, his legal bills and restitution payments having consumed most of his liquid assets. He seemed to read my thoughts. "It's not large, just $5,000 annually. I've committed to funding it for 10 years, regardless of my financial situation. It seemed like the right way to address at least one small part of the damage I caused." For the first time since entering the cafe, I truly looked at Thomas, not as my ex-husband, not as the man who had betrayed me, but as someone struggling to find their way back from profound failure. The designer watch was gone, replaced by something functional and modest. The manicured appearance had given way to a more authentic presentation. Even his posture spoke of someone carrying hard-earned humility rather than practiced confidence. "That's a thoughtful gesture," I acknowledged. "Emma will make her own decisions about her education path, but the scholarship could benefit others with similar interests." Thomas nodded, then glanced at his watch. "I should go. I have class in an hour, and I promised I'd only take 30 minutes of your time." As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "James mentioned that Whitmore Advisory is doing well, that you've made Elena the CEO." A flash of the old Thomas surfaced briefly. "I would have expected you to take that role yourself, after everything." I smiled slightly, recognizing this moment as an opportunity to share the most important lesson of the past year. Not for Thomas's benefit, but as an articulation of my own journey. Success isn't about titles or control, Thomas. It's about building something sustainable, something that reflects your values rather than just your ambitions. Elena is the right leader for Whitmore Advisory's next chapter, just as I'm the right person to guide the Whitmore Foundation's development. The Foundation? A new initiative focused on financial literacy and supporting victims of financial abuse, I explained. Something constructive built from the ashes of what we lost. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You've created meaning from what happened. Built something purposeful rather than just replacing what was taken. Exactly. I gathered my purse, preparing to leave. That's the difference between restoration and revenge. One heals the damage, the other merely transfers it to someone else. Walked to the cafe entrance together, an echo of countless meals and meetings over 15 years of marriage. Yet now as fundamentally different people than we had been through most of those years. "Rebecca," Thomas said as we reached the door, "there's one thing I've wondered but never asked. When did you decide to activate your inheritance? Was it immediately after discovering I had taken the retirement funds, or had you been planning it longer?" The question revealed one final misconception Thomas still carried, that my response had been a long-planned strategy rather than an improvised recovery from betrayal. "I never planned to use my inheritance against you, Thomas. That would have required seeing you as an adversary throughout our marriage, which I didn't. I chose to believe in our partnership, however misplaced that belief ultimately proved to be. His expression registered genuine surprise. "Then when?" "The moment I found the apartment lease and discovered the emptied accounts. That was when I realized I needed to protect myself, not just financially, but from the corrosive effects of betrayal itself." Corrosive effects? Bitterness, victimhood. The temptation to define myself by what was done to me rather than by my response to it. I met his gaze directly. "Using my inheritance wasn't about punishing you, Thomas. It was about refusing to be diminished by your choices." As we parted outside the cafe, Thomas extending his hand in a formal goodbye, I recognized that this meeting had provided something valuable. Not reconciliation, which would never be possible given the foundation of deception our marriage had rested upon, but perspective. The chance to see Thomas not as the villain in my story, but as a flawed human navigating the consequences of his own worst choices, just as I had navigated mine. 2 days later, I sat in the newly established offices of the Whitmore Foundation, reviewing applications for our first program director. The early morning sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the city, illuminating the space that would soon become a center for both education and healing. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Just submitted my grad school apps. Included. Essay about how watching you rebuild from Dad's betrayal inspired my interest in financial psychology. Hope that's okay?" I smiled, typing back. "More than okay. Proud of you for finding your own meaning in our family's story." As I set down the phone, my eyes fell on the framed quote I had placed on my desk, words my grandmother had written in her journal decades earlier. "True wealth isn't measured by what you possess, but by what possesses no power to diminish you when taken away. Thomas had emptied our retirement account, believing he was taking our financial security. In doing so, he had inadvertently revealed the true inheritance I had carried all along, not just the financial resources documented in that weathered envelope, but the resilience, wisdom, and clarity that money could neither provide nor remove. The secret inheritance document had given me options, but my true power had come from the choices I made with those options. Choosing restoration over retribution, purpose over punishment, creation over destruction. In reclaiming all the compartmentalized pieces of myself, I had discovered something no bank account could hold: the unshakable knowledge that my value was intrinsic, not assigned by someone else's estimation. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Maya Anderson, the Foundation's executive director. First workshop curriculum finalized. 20 participants already registered. We're going to change lives. I texted back a simple response. We already are. And that was the ultimate insight, that even the deepest betrayals can become catalysts for transformation when we refuse to be defined by what was taken and instead focus on what can be built from what remains. Thomas had emptied an account, believing he was seizing control of our future. Instead, he had inadvertently set in motion the reclamation of my authentic self and the creation of something far more valuable than what was lost. The retirement fund he had emptied was now restored, but that restoration paled in comparison to the deeper rebuilding that had taken place, of identity, purpose, and possibility. In seeking his fresh start at my expense, Thomas had unwittingly prompted my own renewal, one built on a foundation too solid for anyone else to dismantle. Outside my window, the city continued its busy rhythm, people moving purposefully through their day, each carrying their own stories of loss and recovery, challenge and response. Among them were the future participants in our Foundation's programs, people who would discover, as I had, that financial betrayal need not be the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a more authentic chapter. I opened the Foundation's mission statement document, making one final edit to the concluding paragraph. We believe that true security comes not from what we possess, but from what we understand about money, about relationships, and most importantly, about ourselves. When we integrate that understanding into how we live, no account can ever truly be emptied. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.